Okay, well, Gen Xers and elder millennials are at a point where they may need to start having frank conversations with mom and dad. The boomers are aging, and there are conversations we need to have with our folks that are not going to be easy. Do my parents need help around the house? At what point is cutting the grass and shoveling the snow going to be too much? Who's their power of attorney? What do you do if it's getting obvious that someone is having trouble hearing? If you're bristling because this feels all too familiar and you don't know how to broach these topics, well, today's show is for you. Our guest today is the author of Let's Talk About Aging Parents, a real-life guide to solving problems with 27 essential conversations. And so we're starting one of those conversations right now. We want you to call. Are you helping an aging parent? What have you learned so far on this journey? How's the talk going? 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. I first want to tell you a little bit about my aging parents. It all started with our family piano. We wanted to get a piano for our kids. They aren't cheap, and my parents were contemplating helping us buy one. But then I said, Mom, what if you just gave us the family piano, the one that only gets played once a year when we're home for Christmas? My mom reacted with horror. That piano has been in her living room for more than 40 years. No, she said. But then a few days later, she called and said, you can have the piano. I don't want you to have to deal with this piano when we're dead. Oh my God, hearing my mom talk about her death made me want to die. Turns out, my mom read an article on the gentle art of Swedish death cleaning, where you go through things now and give a lot of it away. That way, your kids aren't burdened with going through heaps of belongings while grieving. So now, every time I see my mom, she has stuff for me. A box of all the birthday cards I received from the ages of 0 to 10, all my old report cards, casserole dishes she's no longer using, Christmas decorations. Like, cool, thanks. But also, quit reminding me that you're doing this because you are going to die. Then there was the time they organized a family Zoom call. I had anxiety for 3 days. One of them had to be sick. Why do they need to talk to all of us at the same time? We logged on to learn they wanted to talk to us about who would be power of attorney. I'm the eldest of 3 kids. I'm a girl, type A, and hate conflict. I'll let you figure out who the power of attorney is. Again, they want to take care of this stuff now to make it easier on us. But then, the other day, my mom texted me the most boomer text ever. She writes, we went and bought our cemetery plot and headstones, so that is done. All the information is in the upstairs office. And she included a picture of the office. I replied, good God. She replied, it was a bit depressing, but it will save you grief. So just as they've always done, my parents are making sure we, the kids, are okay. They are starting conversations about how they're aging. I called my mom yesterday to make sure she was okay with me going public with her preparations. She was. And I told her about the book, Let's Talk About Aging Parents. I said, one of the chapters talks about making sure your parents have 2 handrails to make going up and down the steps easier and safer. Already got that, she said. And I got the piano. Have you started to have the talk with your folks? Well, Laura Tamblyn Watts put together a book called Let's Talk About Aging Parents. She has a lot of experience with this and is here to help. She's CEO of CanAge, Canada's National Seniors Advocacy Organization. Laura, welcome to Blue Sky.
Happy to be here. Thanks. What a great story. And actually, the piano is a great example. You know, we love to have these things, but then sometimes you think to yourself, what am I actually going to do with it? It's really hard to get rid of a piano. Either it's free or it's sort of $10,000 and there's kind of nothing in between. So good on you and your parents for having that talk.
But it was a really hard thing for me to accept because even though I had initiated the conversation, when I realized kind of the thought process that my parents had to go through, and then ending up at that realization, like we're going to have too many pianos to deal with at some point in time here, so let's avoid that. I found it like I found it quite upsetting for quite some time. Like I'm over it now. The kids play the piano, it's okay, but like that was not. I didn't like it.
When we're having these sort of thought processes, it's important to kind of tether it to your family. And by family, I do want to be very inclusive. Whatever it is that you think of as your family, could be friends, could be family of choice, whatever version are the people that you're closest connected to. And think about kind of age and stage. And that's important because I'm a Gen Xer. My parents are actually the greatest generation. They're born in the late 30s. So they're just about to turn 88 years old. And I'm in that classic sandwich. My kids are 21, 22, and 23. But that's actually a little bit less common than it used to be. We are now in a club sandwich. Generation. We usually think of about 5 to 6 generations at the same time. I was helping a man the other day who was in his mid to late 90s, and he was called up to be the substitute decision maker for his son who was in his early 70s who had dementia. And so we don't always do things just in the order of age. And so part of what we need to do is not always just think about it as who's oldest and what's going to happen in that order, but what could happen at any time. Car accident, concussion, whatever.
Yeah. So how do you start all this? Well, actually, even before we talk about how to start these conversations, what made you realize that this book was needed?
25 years of working in the field. And I kept wanting to be able to have a book to give people, because when they come and they have a question, whether it's I'm worried about maybe dad starting to, quote, lose it, or should mom be driving, or all about those stairs, your mom's obviously on the ball, because a small thing like adding a second really well affixed handrail. So it's got to have a good clamp and you got to put it into a stud, right? But that will reduce your falls risk by 56%. Stairs aren't the enemy. Falling is the enemy. And there's tons of tricks. Lots of them are evidence-based and peer-reviewed, but we don't have time to do that. You're driving your kids to soccer. You just need to know, what are the 3 things I need to do? Or how is it that we overcome the broad fears? So if people are worried they're going to be, quote, checking into a nursing home, unquote, which, by the way, that's actually not a thing that we do in Canada, but anyway, what is it they're really afraid of? How can we make it so it's not about a fear, but it's about getting people to have what they want? And that's a very different approach.
I want to remind people that you can call today. Laura is a wonderful person to speak to about some of this stuff. She's got so many ideas and a real wealth of knowledge. So give us a shout today, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. This is a really good time of year to be talking about this. I'm going home at Christmas. My parents don't live in the same city as me. We're going to be seeing my in-laws. This is a good time of year, right, to talk about this?
This is one of the best and worst times of year. So let me tell you why that is. It is not the best time to have it if you're sitting down to your Hanukkah dinner or your giant turkey dinner or whatever is your tradition and say, pass the potatoes or the latkes or the peas. Hey, let's talk about whether or not dad's got dementia. No, not a good time to do that. But what it is a good time to do is check things out. And this is particularly true if you're not there all the time. So my parents live about an hour and a half away. I've got a wealth of in-laws living in different parts, and I only see them sometimes. And of course, when I see them, everything is tickety-boo, right? They've been planning for my visit. Everything's all nicely dressed. The fridge is full of beautiful food, right? It's very curated. But if you're home for longer, you can kind of see those processing questions, right? The what if, or is mom wobbling? Is she holding the hallway with her right hand as she's walking down and she's got something in her left hand? Like those little things, that's a great time. Then maybe don't have the big conversation during the time where we're doing things that are celebratory. But if you got some quiet time afterwards, you can kind of fold that in and find the right way to start the conversation for your family.
What words come to mind for you to raise it?
So parents are your parents. And again, I use that in a broad term, whatever those things are, right? So this idea that we become the parents to our parents, It's nonsense. We are always our parents, and they kind of remember us as being the kind of idiots who crashed the car or left their hockey gear in the front, right? Like, couldn't
They're
match
still
their
doing our
socks.
laundry when we go home for Christmas.
Right. I am 53 years old, and I'm pretty certain. And I kind of revert back. I think a lot of people do kind of revert back a little bit to your kind of younger years, maybe your worst self. So the idea that you're going to come in as this sort of savior and tell them what to do, just get that out of your head right now. But what parents love to do, oh, they love to give advice. And so the great thing is everyone over the age of really 18 should be having a power of attorney document. If your kid plays hockey and they get a knock on the head and they're in travel hockey, they need a power of attorney document if they're an adult, or even like, I don't necessarily think that a 18-year-old is an adult, but like legally they do. Or if your daughter goes skiing and conks her head, or if someone's in a car accident, or you in middle years like me,
Yep.
you know, do you have a mortgage? Is it time to think about getting ready for tax season? So ask your parents their advice. Do they have someone they like? Have they worked with somebody? That's your time also to find out, do they have an accountant? What's the accountant's name? Do you have someone that you rely on? What's the health provider situation looking like, right? These days, do they still have the family doctor? Are they one of, 10% of people who don't? You can ask by giving advice. And then the other piece of advice I have is this. If they don't like to be confronted with those issues, like so many people don't, blame it on the man, right? Tax season is coming up, right? I got to get myself in order for our RRSP season or RESP contributions. Make it about the time, not about the people. And my last tip, if they don't want to talk about themselves, they're probably willing to talk about their friends. So how's so-and-so doing? Oh, they've got, some problems staying at home. They moved into a retirement home. Is it a nice one? Do you like it? Have you ever been there? Maybe we should go pop by sometime, right? That's all these other ways in.
Brilliant. So Jay just sent us an email. Jay writes, how do you deal with it when one parent is accepting that they're getting older and the other is stubborn and won't accept the help?
And so, Jay, thank you. I think that already you're 50% there. That's my first comment. So you've got somebody who's doing it. I guess part of what I want to understand for the other person, right, is what is it they are worried about or resistant about or proud of? So if someone's like 75 and they're doing yoga all the time and they're feeling great and they're mentally well and they're engaged in society, am I really, in my mind, is that quote old? Well, okay, they're getting older, but there's nothing critical. So they may be needing a different way in. So I always ask everyone, particularly this time of year, what's the thing that we're worried about and what's the thing we want to achieve? So let's call it dad is accepting. So that's a different pathway, which means you're going to start kind of going through some of the things with dad. Let's make it mom who's not accepting. Let's hear the words that she says, what she's afraid of. Let's get her talking about her other family and so on. Then curate the conversation for a just in case or an emergency kind of thing rather than a growing old narrative.
When people are at home, or if they're home for the holidays, taking stock of kind of what the house looks like, you mentioned I mentioned the two handrails, but a lot of people want to age in place. And so how can we have productive conversations about where people are living, the loved ones in our lives, where are they living?
The first whole chunk of my book, it's really about going through the house room by room. And I actually have like a single dollar sign, double dollar sign, triple dollar sign, because some things are incredibly inexpensive. Second banister, what, 50 to 80 bucks? It's not a lot of money. You can do it yourself, right? But there's a lot of other great tricks that you can do either yourself or maybe just get a handy person in if that's not going to be you, and you can make a huge difference. Part of it is also looking at the space in a different way. One of the biggest concerns for folks is I don't have a main floor bedroom or I don't have a main floor shower, right? And so they're worried. And yeah, that is a bit of a challenge. But one of the things that we talk about in the book is, okay, how to imagine the space differently. Remember that dining room that nobody has eaten at since like 2008, right? Except for, right?
Or 1998.
Right, exactly. Right. So, I mean, if you're a family that doesn't really use the formal dining room, let's just call it that, for instance, take out that beautiful Victorian table and chairs that are rickety or, look pretty, and put in sliding barn doors. And you can make that usually an accessible bedroom. And that even allows people to put in a hospital bed if they need. Well, what about not having a main floor shower? Well, if you can put one in, that's great. You can use often of the laundry room and bathroom kind of co-located if you're thinking about that, because the stack is there. For some folks, maybe just changing that powder room into what we call like a Swedish wet room, right? So you put an extendable nozzle where that faucet is. And if it's a wet room, even if it's a wee little one, you can do kind of a hand shower and do that. That's a great thing. You don't maybe have to have it right now. Look at the bathtub. That's always an issue, but there's good new bathtub things that you could do right now. Non-slip surfaces are really important. Bathrooms, showers, and main floor bedrooms are really the biggest things to do. And the last thing, it's a slippery time. I was listening to that weather report, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Really, really important to get outdoor handrails. And they, again, doesn't have to be expensive. Outdoor handrails. So they say, that lovely garden path, right? Yeah, okay. But what you actually need to do is have good handrails, both sides, preferably with a non-slip brick or whatever it is that you use for your path outway, so that they have the ability to leave their house too. Because what happens is people get stuck inside 6 months of the year.
What about the money? So you mentioned a couple of really cost-effective, like the banisters, as not costing a ton of money. But those dollar signs kind of are in my mind right now, and what it could potentially cost a family to support a loved one.
So let's think about cost in a couple of different ways. There's, if you can stay at home or you have a place that you can stay, then you're thinking about kind of home rental costs. In the book, Let's Talk About Aging Parents, literally goes through room by room and kind of costs it out for you. And so there's lots of great, not too expensive things you can do. Obviously, anyone can do a renovation. That's, if you have the money, you can do it. Another piece that people may want to think about, though, is the cost of care. Mm-hmm. And, in our province and frankly across this country, we know that the cost of care is skyrocketing and people mostly want to stay at home. And home care, I don't know a lot of people who say that the publicly funded home care meets their needs, right? Yeah. I really think that people have to get a good understanding about that. In a city, $100,000 to $300,000 a year is not an unreasonable amount of money to worry, like if you want 24/7 home care. And that's not an RN. That's just like personal health worker or a healthcare rate, someone who's got a little bit of training. So I don't know a lot of people that can afford that kind of money, and certainly maybe could be 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years. So you have to really think about what the cost of care is. So lots of people are doing things like moving back home or co-locating. They may be renting out part of their house. The Canada Home Share program is a great example where they match graduate students to live with older adults in exchange for a bit of help around the house. Not medical care, but it's sort of those daily tasks, shoveling, walking the dog, those types of things. And that can be really good. So when we're thinking about costs, we have to think about what's not covered by their healthcare system. And we have to think about, whether home modifications. One of the last things you're going to think about is, okay, if I'm not going to be able to stay in this physical, maybe it's a house, maybe it's a condo, it just doesn't work for you. And you're thinking, well, maybe I'll move into some place that's got some services, right? The kind of traditional retirement home. Double check, make sure you have a good sense of how much those do cost, because they can range like $2,500 a month to, how long is a piece of string? $10,000, $15,000 a month. And if you can maybe not go visit them if they don't want themselves to confront that question, but if they've got friends who are in certain retirement homes, maybe you go in with them and they have a nice lunch together over the holidays and you can get a sense of what they look like and whether your family likes them or not. Social isolation is one of the biggest costs of all, and we don't actually necessarily think of it in terms of a dollar sign. So often moving together in some kind of way or being close to people and services, that's actually not just preventative for healthcare concerns, like you're going to do better if you're surrounded by people that you know and you've got resources to, but actually bringing people far. So if you're in rural communities, it can cost more.
Our guest today is Laura Tamblyn Watts. She's the author of Let's Talk About Aging Parents, a real-life guide to solving problems with 27 essential conversations. I'm guessing that our listeners probably have some really good questions for you, Laura. Like, I've got my list, but I know people listening are living this right now. So give us a call today, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. You are listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1. I'm Leisha Gerbinski. One of our guests today is Laura Tamblyn Watts, the author of Let's Talk About Aging Parents. Laura, you've got a whole section here, a whole chapter. How should I care for my parent who has dementia? This is a big topic. What's a good starting point for this? The signs even, right? To be paying attention to someone's changing mental capacity.
If your parents are running around and can't find their car keys, that's not dementia. That's also me in the morning, right? That's not dementia. There's no such thing as a senior moment. People put things different places aside. That's not dementia. If your parent is sitting in the car holding their car keys and they don't know what the key is for or how the key and the car relate to each other, that's a different kind of thing. So what we're trying to really weigh off here is what are the analysis points that they may be missing. So we talk about the decisional capacity, right? Is the ability to understand information and appreciate the consequences. And that's got to get below that social masking, those nice chit-chat conversations we have. How are you doing today? Good to see you again, right? But there's lots of covering up that can happen again. What you really want to do is try to get in if you're asking, what would you do if dad fell and you live, out here in the country? Like, how would you deal with that? And then see what they say. Think of it as a funnel of asking narrow questions, but big open questions, and see what the analysis is like. I just want to give people one little fact, though. Mental capacity, it's usually declining 7 to 9 years before a diagnosis in this country. And the first thing is what we call executive function. That's that abstract reasoning, which often happens with things like investments. They may know how to do day-to-day banking, but that extrapolative reasoning, that risk analysis or what things mean, that often hits first.
And what does that do to the people around that individual? Like, if you finally do get that diagnosis and this is what's coming or what life's going to be like, how does that affect the people around them?
We just finished a report at CanAge released earlier this week, which had the voices of people with lived experiences, the people with dementia and their caregivers. And one of the topics we talked about was, what did it feel like to get that diagnosis? And it was horrible. I mean, I can't tell you how bad it was. So the people who were being diagnosed with dementia, many of them said that they had PTSD from getting that diagnosis as badly and harshly as they got it. And that their first set of thoughts was, how do I get medical assistance in dying? I mean, that's a breakdown in our healthcare system. We can give people hard news better than we do right now. So we need to give people some scenarios. What could this look like? We don't tell people with cancer, hey, you've got cancer, in such a way that people then think, oh my goodness, this is the end of my life. You talk about pathways. What could it be like? What are my chances? And I think it's really important to remember also that a diagnosis of dementia doesn't mean that you automatically can't do stuff. It's a medical condition. You may still be able to go to school, live your life, do your job. It means that some parts of your brain are now neurodiverse, that they're not thinking the way that others, and we may need more accessibility and neurological supports, often the way that we do with people with other neuro conditions, for instance, like autism, right? There's ways that we can adapt to make sure that people live good, fulsome lives. Yes, dementia at this point will eventually kill you, but lots of people with dementia die about other things before. So let's make sure that people who have dementia and their care supporters, who probably, by the way, already know, are well supported. And that support is such an important piece.
I'm going to bring Connie into the conversation here in just a moment because she knows exactly what you're talking about, Laura. But just to put this in context a bit, how this is going to affect so many, I mean, it already is affecting a lot of people. Like when I heard about the rates, it was just so much higher than I had realized. And again, thinking about an aging population, just how much is this going to affect? How many people could this potentially affect? And I'm not talking about numbers, but just that kind of like this is something a lot of us need to pay attention to, hey?
So I can give you the numbers about people who have diagnosis and people who we think probably do have it. Something like a diagnosis, 700,000 up to 900,000, and then how many people probably have some form of dementia that is undiagnosed. If you put those together, maybe 1.4 million is what we're looking at over the fairly near future. This is a big, big number. Now, the reality of the circumstance, though, is who's it affecting? I don't know anybody who doesn't have some form of impairment in their family in terms of neurological impairment, whether it be dementia, Alzheimer's, whether it be some other types of mental health issues. So if we think about who does this affect, it affects everyone. The working title of my book, Let's Talk About Aging Parents, was The 3 a.m. Guide to Your Aging Parents, because as a working person, you're up at 3 a.m. doing the PowerPoint that you were supposed to be doing when you're taking mom to her appointments, or you're up worrying and the police has been called because they think someone's breaking in. It affects all of us. And I'll just close by saying one important thing that I know your caller will talk about and your guest will talk about. We used to have what we call a dependency ratio, terrible term, dependency ratio of one older person to about 4 to 6 supporters, that kind of adult children or folks around them, right? It's the opposite now. So in my generation, Gen X generation, I can expect to take care of 4 to 6 older people, and probably half of them will have dementia.
Oh my goodness. Well, let's go to Connie, who's sitting right next to me. Connie Snyder works with the organization called the Sandwich Club. The Alzheimer's Society of Saskatchewan offers numerous support groups, and one of them is the Sandwich Club. You've been listening, Connie. I'm just wondering kind of what's running through your mind first.
Well, the first thing I think about is the numbers in Saskatchewan. We have over 20,000 people in Saskatchewan living with dementia, and those numbers are certainly rising. And in, conjunction to what Laura was saying, every person knows, every 3 out of 4 people know somebody with dementia or that's been affected. And the Sandwich Club that I support here in Saskatchewan, as you said, is a program of the Alzheimer's Society of Saskatchewan. We are there to support the folks that are trying to provide that care. And so we had our meeting last night, and the themes are so similar to what's in her book. Mm-hmm. Guilt. I noticed in one of the sections she talks about guilt, and that certainly is a big thing.
Tell me more about that. I mean, I can totally understand that, right? It's just, but elaborate on how people express that emotion to you.
Well, it hits you coming and going. Good conversation last night was, I used to feel guilty because I wasn't able to do enough for Mom. And now that she's in care, I know she's safe and I don't have to do as much. But now I feel guilty because maybe I'm not spending enough time with her, or I'm doing more things for myself now and maybe I shouldn't be. Mm-hmm. So I feel guilty about taking time for myself. And, we're always encouraging caregivers the importance of self-care, because if they don't look after themselves, then they're not going to be much help to them. And it becomes more and more complex, too, because it's often you're supporting maybe a parent with dementia, but also their primary caregiver or their life partner. And it comes to the point where you have to actually focus more on the person without dementia because you worry about them.
Yeah. What else do people express to you in that Sandwich Club?
The changes in relationships. Laura touched on that too, about, you don't become the parent, but you have to plant lots of seeds around, how do you talk about those powers of attorney, those pivotal things that are so important to the parent. But yeah, they're not going to listen if you say, hey, Mom, do you have that in place? But if you say, I was thinking about going to see the lawyer because I think everybody should have a power of attorney and advance care directive. What do you think about that? Or would you come with me? Mm-hmm. Do you have
I'm
those?
doing mine, or do you want to?
Exactly.
Yeah. Mm-hmm,
We've got ours, or we're going to work on ours. Let's do it as a family thing. Maybe we'll get a deal at the lawyer's office. Who knows?
That's a good one.
But even the complex relationships, too. We're sometimes having to care for a parent that maybe our relationship wasn't that great with them.
Yeah.
And so all of a sudden, we're having to take over a bit of that role.
Yeah, and I know I'll talk with you, Laura, a bit about that because, there are toxic relationships that we have to navigate too. But Connie, I want to hear from you how you would suggest someone how they navigate those signs of dementia. What advice might you have after having all of this experience with the Sandwich Club? What do people do if they're starting to notice some changes?
The Alzheimer's Society, we do have a Getting a Diagnosis toolkit, and so it is based on the 10 warning signs that are categorized under abilities, behavior, and communication. And so we can provide families with that information on, how do you take that information to maybe that person's general practitioner if they don't have the insight into the changes. So we'll talk with them I'm a First Link coordinator with the Alzheimer's Society, and so part of our job is to have those conversations with family members, like how do you approach that, especially if that insight isn't there. So it is learning about the warning signs so that you might be able to recognize that in your parent.
And how do you help people avoid burnout? That's kind of like the first thing that you brought up, right? That's such a big thing.
Well, that's self-care. It's making sure people remember that they're just as important as the person that they're supporting, and how, self-care doesn't mean necessarily a trip to Hawaii. When it's minus 30, it would be lovely, but, it can be as simple as having a bubble bath or taking some time to breathe.
A walk.
A walk, absolutely.
Do you find that demand is going up for the Sandwich Club?
Very much so. Unfortunately, right now, our group is closed because we can't take on any more right now for the capacity, but we're certainly there outside of the support groups as an organization to provide individual care as well and support to families. And, going back to something else that Laura said was about, people thinking that if you're given a diagnosis that life is over. And unfortunately, the stigma is there and people automatically go to end of life. They think, that diagnosis means life is over. And we really work at the Alzheimer's Society of Saskatchewan to try to teach people that they can live well with dementia. And we give them the tips and the tools. And I always liken it to our job is to provide them with a good toolkit. And we do the same thing in the Sandwich Club as we help these caregivers that are in the middle of trying to balance everything with pieces for their toolkit.
Both you, Connie, and Laura, you're such great resources today. So please don't hesitate to call us. You might have a question that would be good to direct to Connie or one for Laura. Give us a call today, 1-800-716-2221. You can also email bluesky@cbc.ca. Connie's not going anywhere. You're going to keep listening. But there are those two points that I wrote down that I want to ask Laura about. Do you want to talk about guilt, Laura? Because whether it's dementia or Parkinson's or any kind of illness, there's just a lot of guilt associated with caregiving.
There's a lot of guilt. And there's a whole chapter I wrote in Let's Talk About Aging Parents about guilt. And I didn't take it off and kind of wave my hand around. And I actually went through, let's assess what kind of guilt it is. Because sometimes the feeling of guilty actually is us intuitively thinking, I actually got to pay attention to something, right? It's not necessarily always a bad thing. Sometimes it's that warning sign in the back of your head, like I'm feeling guilty about X. So it helps you go through, what is it you're actually feeling guilty about? I get people to do a bit of a thought exercise. Is it because you're doing something or not doing? Did I knock mom down the stairs? I feel guilty. I didn't mean to do it, but she broke her hip and I feel guilty about a thing that's direct. Okay, fair enough. You can feel guilty about that. You didn't mean to do it. You knocked her down the stairs. She feels like, bad as a result. Okay, right? Fine. Do you feel guilty because you should have reminded the caregiver to come and also should have reminded your daughter to come back early from soccer practice, because then mom might no.
Yeah.
Right? That's actually not that. Now you're in a different thing. Now you're just kind of spinning in your head. So I actually help you kind of go through that. Part of the point of guilt is you have to think about it within your cultural expectations. Does your parent have a different sense of what your role or other people's role is? Are you fulfilling that role? Do you also agree with that role? Is there a mismatch in culture? And maybe think about the guilt in that regard. Did they have an expectation they would move in with you and your spouse is like, that might make sense in the old country, but actually we're not doing that here, right? And so maybe we need to open that up and figure out, is it a mismatch in terms of cultural expectations? The last thing I would say is, when we talk about self-care, that's no joke. Right? That's no joke, because we know the statistics on caregivers who get burnout, and they spend their own money and they get their own illnesses and they get often mental health conditions. And in fact, You can get a greater likelihood of dementia if you are a burnt out caregiver, right? So we're thinking about this as being in for the long run. Part of what we also have to understand is just because you said, I know mom will never quote put you in a home, unquote, which, whatever that means, but it doesn't mean that they can't get care. And so part of what we need to think about is our guilt because we can't do everything? Is our guilt because we don't want to confront our changing relationships? Is it a guilt because you grew up with gender norms and you're a woman and they you feel like maybe you shouldn't be in the workforce, but you should be at home? Unpack it and see what that guilt is actually about.
I want to come back to something you said about cultural expectations because, so my experience is I live with my 2 kids and my spouse. My parents live elsewhere, but there are so many homes of intergenerational families, and it's so true, right? That culturally there are different expectations of how to take care of folks as they age. And I just wonder if you can just touch on that a bit more, that aspect of cultural expectations and really what households look like in Canada these days.
Households are really an interesting mix now and are in some cases going back to multi-generational living in urban centers in particular, often because it's so expensive to buy a house. Mm-hmm. And so we're off now getting sort of 3 and 4 generations living in a home who might not have necessarily always expected to have that cultural norm, but it's actually coming down to it. They actually, making a garden suite, or the family is moving home because that's the only way that dad can just stay in the home. So that is a thing that's changing. But on the whole, there is still this norm that we will live separate lives, right? And so if you come from a culture where it is expected, let's just say as a South Asian culture, or you're an Asian culture, or you're a culture where family, quote unquote, lives together, and of course mom will move in, or dad and mom will move in, or will move in with them, and you marry someone who's not from that culture, that may not be something that you talked about when you got married at 25. But now you're 50 and there is this, well, of course mom's going to move in, right? And that's where you end up sometimes in couples therapy, or you have to kind of unpack what those cultural norms is so you don't bang into each other. I would say come from an asset base. So one of the things in my book, Let's Talk About Aging Parents, helps you break out all of the kind of individual tasks that go into this and helps people kind of sign up for it. So if you're the family member that lives in Vancouver and dad lives in rural Saskatchewan, you can't do everything. But what you can do is some things, like maybe some of the financial supports, because you can do that. But seeing those tasks can help both the guilt and can help us rethink, well, do we have to live in the same place, or can we break out the different jobs? Because actually some of them can be done from a distance now.
I'm speaking with Laura Tamblyn Watts, who's the author of Let's Talk About Aging Parents. We do still have Connie Snyder with us, who is connected to the Sandwich Club that helps support caregivers of people who are living with Alzheimer's. I will come back, Laura, to how you deal with toxic relationships in families, and how it's not easy ever, but then it can really not be easy. And how do you deal with that? But I just want to go to a caller first who joins us on the line. Dave here in Saskatoon is with us right now. Dave, welcome to Blue Sky.
Glad to be here. I just want to relate my experience in rural New Brunswick and see whether the same thing would apply to urban Saskatoon. Mm-hmm. I was the executive director of the Upper Nashwauk Community Outreach Association, and we got men and women certified by the province as home support workers, and we also ran out of the office Meals on Wheels and Lifeline, the Help I've Fallen and I Can't Get Up kind of thing. And we would meet regularly to see, okay, who can stay in their home, or who do we think needs help that we can't specifically provide. But those 3 things let people in rural New Brunswick stay in their home for years longer than they thought they were going to be able to.
Well, Laura has a ton of experience with this, because I keep talking about how she's the author of this book, but she's also she leads Canada's National Seniors Advocacy Organization. So, Laura, what are your thoughts on that?
It's so important. Those in-home community-based supports are usually the thing that lets people stay in those communities. And whether you're in a really rural or remote area where you're kind of banding together, you're supported by maybe an outreach worker, you've got maybe a social worker or an occupational therapist, those kind of naturally occurring retirement communities, those communities that are aging together, can often get together and hire an OT that comes to that community. Or maybe the United Way or another community-based organization's got something like what we call a Better at Home program. In many communities, particularly rural one, there's new paramedic programs, which are very interesting, where they do what they call hospital without walls. For folks who may need things that would ordinarily take them into a hospital, often they may not be able to get there, things even in some cases like a dialysis, but COPD care, other types of monitoring and supports, heart care. There are some programs where paramedics can come in and they connect with community-based organizations to allow this hospitals at home aging in place model. Lots of great stuff happening there and in Saskatchewan as well.
Okay, well, let's go to another caller because the phones are lighting up now. So Kristen joins us in Regina. Kristen, welcome to Blue Sky.
Hi. Basically, I have a question, just more so dealing with my experience of having a grandparent transition from being independent to dependent. And it was incredibly difficult because they didn't necessarily plan for that transition, and they sort of left their house to a state where in order to stay in their house and get the care, it just was an impossibility. And what I've been finding really hard to find is there any sort of supports that are there to help seniors transition to that next stage? I'm finding it hard to find sort of like mental health supports. I know that it's there's a stigma around mental health, especially of that generation. It's okay for other people, but not for me. They don't want to be around those old people, and then they laugh when you tell them, but you are those old people. So that's, I guess, my question.
Thanks, Kristen. Laura, what do you say?
No, I mean, and that's not the answer that I want to give you. That the answer should be yes. Of course, there are those helps in transitions. Yes, of course, we've got outreach social workers. Yes, of course, we've got community-based social services that help you find the next good place to live. The reality is they're often few and far between, and where they do exist, they exist in urban centers. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book, is we shouldn't be as on our own as we are, but you've identified a really important gap in many of our systems.
Thanks for calling, Kristen. Let's go to Ellen in Regina. Hey, Ellen, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm 64 years old, and I looked after my mom for a number of years, and she's passed away now 25 years, so we're going back a ways. And it was just beginning to get support from family members looking after their loved ones. And one program that was a lifesaver was at adult daycare. Yeah. And my mom went every Tuesday and Thursday. She lived with me for 2 years, and every Tuesday the buddy bus picked her up and took her there, and she had her bath. And she had programs, meals, and it was incredible, such a lifesaver. And I know I know they still have a program in Regina, an adult day center program, but I'm wondering if I think a program like that could be expanded because it's a lifesaver.
Connie, you were nodding your head. You're familiar with something like that?
Yes, I am.
Yeah, so that still exists.
Yes.
And Laura, you were nodding too, like, yeah, that's like essential, hey?
And respite support, just building on that point. So adult day programs, and I heard, coming to pick up is a really important thing. So lots of people actually have transportation needs that they need to be addressed as well. The opportunity to connect with other folks. I also love those intergenerational programs where you've got young kids and older kids engaging together, great outcomes regarding that. But again, that social connection and the respite. The respite is important. So many families say, if I could just have a couple weeks off to just take a break. And again, whether or not you are having those resources there, or you've got to kind of connect those with your other family members to do them, a place to go and a place to actually have somebody take a break for both the caregiver and the person who's receiving care is critically important to a good relationship.
It's huge. I just want to take the last minute here, Laura, for you to touch on. People listening might be like, I don't want to help them. They weren't there for me when I was young. What do you do then?
So lots of people don't have that leave it to beaver relationship. In fact, I don't think a lot of people do have them. First of all, that's okay. Got to say that right away, right? It's got to destigmatize that. Number two, is there anyone else who can help? Okay, maybe it shouldn't be you, right? Maybe it should be somebody else. If you are the only one right? Then you're going to assess to see what is it you're trying to achieve. You may find that they were a terrible parent, but a great grandparent. So my book actually helps you navigate where are boundaries? What can we do about that? How much can we put certain amounts of time? Can you hire folks? So trust companies can actually run the finances, and that can take you out. But you may need to still make some of those personal healthcare decisions. If you can't do it, you shouldn't do it, because what you don't want to be is on the other end of a kind of an abusive situation where you end up kind of giving back what you got. And the book will help you kind of create boundaries and map out who else can help, who's got money, and what are the kinds of touch points that are most useful. Maybe I'm not doing all of the burden, but maybe I'm doing social visit once a month, and we keep it in a public place.
So good to have both of you here with us today. My mom was texting me for the name of the book. Laura, we're both going to, read it more deeply. I'll get out my highlighter and we'll keep having those conversations.
Everyone, get it on audio, but people don't have time to read, right? They're listening in their car on the way back and forth to a point. An audiobook is a fun thing for people to do. And it's just in time. You open the chapter in the section you need. You don't have to read it from beginning to end. And I promise it'll make you laugh all the way through.
Yeah. And I mean, there's topics we didn't get a chance to talk about. Like lots of people are divorced. And how do you deal with that? And how do you keep connections with the grandkids? Like you've got a lot in here. So thank you for the book, Laura. And it's been a real treat having you as a guest today. Thank you.
Thanks for the conversation.
And Connie, so good to have you with us too. For people listening locally who are dealing with someone who's got dementia, it's so good to hear about the Sandwich Club. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
It's Connie Snyder, and also hearing from Laura Tamblyn Watts. I'm Leisha Grabinski. You've been listening to Blue Sky here on CBC Radio 1.